All right, well, thank you all for coming. This is going to be a high-level overview of CMMC and more importantly, investing in some education that we provide for CMMC, which is called the Certified CMMC Professional, and how it can benefit you and more importantly, your organization. I'm Evan Neufeld, the business development representative here at Edwards. And I am joined by Matt Hoeper, our senior cybersecurity consultant, lead assessor, trainer, and I'll let him finish out the introduction for him.
As Evan mentioned, my world has been pretty much revolved around CMMC in the last 3 years, just getting organizations ready for it, helping train assessors who will go and assess organizations. I want to talk a little bit about kind of why we're here with CMMC. For those of you who aren't familiar with CMMC, it's a cybersecurity maturity model certification. And what happened was it stemmed out of members of the defense industrial base not taking security as seriously as they probably should have. So there's a whole bunch of rules and regulations, but I kind of narrow it down here for you. So the Department of Defense doesn't make anything. They don't produce anything. They're good at fighting wars. They're good at spending money. But they don't make things. They rely on the defense industrial base, which is made up of about 350,000 members, to make things that they purchase, things like helicopters and Humvees and you name it, anything that the Department of Defense needs. The problem is that there's a bunch of people, a bunch of those companies in the supply chain. And so we have information. We're not talking about classified information here. This is controlled unclassified information, but they have to share information. So if you have a company that has signed a contract with the Department of Defense that they need 100,000 Humvees. Well, one company isn't going to make that Humvee from bumper to bumper. They're going to have a supplier making rear view mirrors or brake lights or tires or wheels or engine parts. And so in order for the members in that supply chain to be able to build what they need to build, they have to share information. And that information that we're talking about here is controlled unclassified information. So when you sign a contract as a member of the Defense Industrial Base, when you sign a contract either with the Department of Defense or in that supply chain, there is something in the contract called the DFARS clause. It's 252.204.7012. Fancy numbers that won't be on the test, but you're basically saying that you adhere to that clause in 7012, which says it talks about safeguarding covered defense information, or in this case, CUI, and an incident handling reporting capability. So you sign that. Up until, well, now I guess, it was largely self-attestation. It was all self-attestation. So basically what would happen is you would say, we are adhering to that 7012 clause that's safeguarding covered defense information and an incident handling reporting capability. But how do we safeguard it? Well, we safeguard it by adhering to the 110 practices in NIST Special Publication 800-171. So you have 7012, which is in your contract, and the NIST 800-171 publication that has all of these controls, things like, do you perform background checks on employees? Do you have endpoint protection? Do you scan for viruses? Are you careful about who has access to your network? And there's all of these things that you need to do. And up through now, it's been self-attestation, saying, yes, I do that. Yes, I do that. Check, check, check. Well, the problem is that it wasn't being done. The information was still being leaked or stolen by our adversaries. And so the DoD said, this self-attestation thing is just not working anymore. We need to set up a program by which we have independent people assessing these organizations to make sure that they're doing what they say they're doing. Because either through willful neglect or maybe an ignorance of what they need to be doing, it just wasn't being done. So that's why they set this up. And it's really safeguarding two types of information. The first is federal contract information, and that is information related to that contract up to and including that contract. So that's federal contract information. The second type of information is the CUI, what I had talked about, the covered defense information and the 7012 rule. That CUI is kind of a portion of FCI. If you think of FCI being this giant circle, CUI would be a circle inside that. And it's more sensitive information that we need to give more safeguards to. That, what you see on the slide, is the legal definition for it. But the first question that I ask when I'm talking with organizations is, are you in possession of CUI, controlled unclassified information? And more often than not, they're going to be like, I don't know, or yes, but I don't know what it is and what isn't. And so sometimes we try to help organizations figure out what is and what isn't. But I always end up saying, talk to your contract officer, maybe talk to the prime to figure out what you're in possession of. Because whether or not you're in possession of it determines what you have to do from a safeguarding perspective. If you're only in possession of federal contract information, then you only have to be doing 17 things. But if you're in possession of the CUI, you have to be doing all 110 things. And that's a bigger lift, right? So if we go to the next slide, we talk a little bit about what's the expectation here. The Department of Defense doesn't really know the exact number. It's really an estimate. I've heard as low as 300,000, but as high as 425,000. Basically, what you need to take away is there's a lot. There are a lot of companies in the defense industrial base that help in the supply chain to produce goods and services to the Department of Defense. And even somebody who has, maybe they mow the grounds of a Army base would have federal contract information because they have a contract with the government. Now, would they be in possession of FCI or of CUI? Probably not, since they're just mowing, but you just don't know. And so we want to make sure that we educate organizations to what their mandates are going to be. And so we're talking about a lot of money, $414.5 billion in DIB contracts. It's a tremendous amount of money. The issue is as we roll out this CMMC program, which is an assessment program against the special publication 80171 and the practices therein. Some of you might think of them as controls, and you would be accurate in that. We want to make sure that no one loses out on a contract, because now, in order to win a contract, as this program rolls out, in order to win a contract, you have to be at a particular level. Now, currently, we have 3 levels. The very initial, for those of you who've been around a while, the initial CMMC, when it proposed rule dropped, had 5 levels. But they've reduced it to 3. And so the foundational, level 1, are the 17 practices that I had mentioned earlier. And we're talking very basic things like, do you lock your doors of your facility? Do you have endpoint protection? Do you update that endpoint protection? Do you scan for new viruses? And then in access control, there's things like, do you know who your users are when they access the system? Things like that. Very, very basic stuff. So the first level is for FCI. If you're only in possession of federal contract information, and that's it still stays a self-attestation, self-assessment, and you have to align with those 17 practices. Here's the thing, though. You need to have somebody, if you are in just level 1, you do have to have somebody senior in your organization sign off. So this is not an issue where it's just the IT manager's problem. While it might be the IT manager's quote unquote problem to implement this stuff, when it comes to final sign off, someone senior in the organization is going to have to say, yes, we attest to these 17 practices. So if the 350,000 members of the DIB, I would venture to say that the vast majority of them would probably be at a level 1, but then we move to level 2. And those are the people, the organizations that are in possession of that controlled unclassified information. That information that is deemed more sensitive and requires more safeguarding. So of the 350,000, and again, that's just an estimate, we think that anywhere between 80 and 100,000 of those would probably need to be at a level 2 because they are in possession of the controlled unclassified information. When you get to level 2, you have to have an organization, what we call a C3 PAO. And if you guys are in IT, you understand that we love our acronyms. CMMC is no different. But you have to have a C3 PAO, which is a CMMC third-party assessment organization, come out and assess you, which means the ante is up to just a little bit, because now you're not doing a self-attestation. You have to have an organization come out and assess you, and you have to be doing all 110 practices. So that is a situation where you'd have the third-party assessment organization come out, assess you, and that assessment is good for 3 years. On the off years, you still have to do that annual self-assessment. So in year one, you have the C3PAO come out, assess you, you get that certification, and that certification is good for 3 years. But in year two, you do the annual self-assessment. In year three, you do the annual self-assessment, again, against all 110 practices. And then year four, which is 3 years removed from year one, you would have a C3PAO come out, assess you again, and that assessment then is good for 3 years. Now, there are some situations where some organizations in possession of a particular type of CUI, and we're not clear on what that is, could still do a self-assessment. It's called bifurcation. So there are some instances where if you are in possession of CUI at level, and you need to be at level 2, that you can do a self-assessment. We're not sure what that is. My guess is it's going to be a very few number. Most of the organizations that have to be at level 2 will need that C3PAO to come out and assess them. Then level 3, which is more sensitive, even more sensitive type of information. Of the 350,000, I've heard like somewhere around 1,000 to 1,500 of those organizations would need to be at level 3. That takes all of the practices at level 2, the 110, and then adds a few more, 32, 35 more, that are based on 800 172. So if you're curious about what those are currently, you can look at 800 172 and figure what those are. But my guess is the vast majority of those organizations that are in possession of CUI would need to be at level 2. So, so this is another way of showing it. So the level 1 is that basic safeguarding, those 17 practices. Those 17 practices actually came out of FAR Clause 52.204-21. And the FAR clause has 15 practices. And you're like, wait a minute, Matt, you said 17. Well, what they did was they took the 15 in the FAR clause, and where you see the physical ones, where it talks about escort visitors, monitor visitor activity, and they break it out. They broke it out into 2 more controls. So they didn't really add anything. They just broke it out because that particular control in the physical domain has a lot of commas. And so they just wanted to break that out into 2 more controls. That's why there are 17 in level 1. So that's based on the FAR clause. In level 2, that is based on currently NIST 800 Special Publication 800-171. Now, I want to preface this all by saying CMMC has not been implemented yet. The rulemaking is still in progress. The comment period has closed. The DoD, as a government agency, takes a while to answer all of the comments, to reply all of the comments in the comment period, and then we'll see it roll out. And I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like later. But that level 2 is based on the NIST 800-171 revision 2. And then level 3 is based on the NIST 800-172. So kind of what to expect. So the CMMC was first introduced in January of 2020. So we're talking a little over 4 years ago. And as with every government rule or legislation or anything related to the government, it takes a while, right? And so we expect that the final rule will be done and completely final by the end of this year, in which time it will start to show up in contracts. And they're going to phase it out. It's not going to show up in every contract right away. Not every contract is up for renewal in 2024. Some are going to be renewed in 2025 and 2026. And so when it does start to roll out and you see the CMMC rule in your contract, then you'll start to have to adhere to it. Now, you can bid on a contract without having the required level of that contract, but you can't win it unless you have it. So you can bid on that contract, but you have to have it at time of award or you won't be awarded that contract. And if it is a level 2, you'll have to have that certification by a C3PAO, unless you're one of the very few that are able to self-attest at level 2. But there's going to be quite a few. Most of the organizations are going to need to adhere to the C3PAO coming out. What we're seeing, though, is the other government organizations. So CUI, Control Unclassified Information, is government-wide, right? So we have CUI all over. CMMC as it stands, is only pertaining to the DoD. But we think that as this rolls out, if it is truly successful, which we hope it will, because we want to make sure that our data stays safe and isn't exfiltrated into the hands of nation states who would seek us harm. Other government agencies may adopt CMMC, so we might see it go more beyond just the Department of Defense. And if you have an external service provider, whether it's a cloud service provider or a managed services provider, those service providers are probably going to be on the hook to do more. Because if you look at the controls in 800.171, you'll see that things like access control or personnel security applies to those external service providers, right? Because they're working on those systems. At a very base level, a managed services provider is going to provide you backups, patching, and monitoring. In order to do that, they have to have access to those systems that likely could contain controlled unclassified information. So that brings them in scope. So we're seeing, some scrambling on the part of external service providers to make sure that they're adhering to these practices in 800.171 as well.
So, this is our shameless plug. So, a little bit about Edwards is, we're actually the only organization fully certified to support the entire CMMC ecosystem. So, like Matt said, there are about 52, last time I checked, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, C3PAOs, which are, again, that CMMC third-party assessment organizations that once that final rulemaking goes into effect, will be able to provide that level 2 certification that you need to win an award. And again, like Matt said, there are about 350 organizations that need CMMC. So you can imagine it's going to be kind of crazy. In addition to that, we are also able to provide consulting hours, as well as we actually wrote on behalf of the Cyber AB. We're one of 9 organizations that wrote curriculum to train the assessors within the ecosystem, as we call it, to provide those assessments. So we wrote that training, and then we also provide it as well as license it out to a bunch of organizations. And right now we've trained about 28% of the entire marketplace for CCPs, which is that first level of professional. And then I think the number goes up to like 36% of all assessors in the marketplace, which are the final word in the assessment. We have come through our curriculum. So moving on from there, what is our curriculum? So we have partnered and collaborated with Baylor to provide in-person training options at both their Central Texas cyber range and Baylor University. Our CCP, which again is that first level of assessor training, which is a 5-day course, 40 hours, and it covers all level 1, which is at 17 controls, and level 2 of CMMC, which is 110 practices, and more importantly, the objectives associated with each one. So in our workings, and Matt, feel free to chime in, oftentimes in our initial calls and debriefs with our clients, the biggest struggle is making sure that they fully are aware of what they need to do to comply with CMMC. So making sure that you as either internal IT, a consultant, an MSP, or what have you, have a full grasp of all 320 objectives, and making sure that your SSP goes down to the objective level, which is your system security plan, is integral to passing the assessment, as well as having team members, because at the end of the day, you as an organization seeking that certification are going to have to own the assessment, not your consultant, not your MSP. So what's the objective of the course? Well, obviously, it should be able to define, understand, apply, and implement CMMC within your environment, because again, there is no one size fits all in CMMC. We are all doing different things to achieve, well, the common goal. And just a little bit more. So just like there are 4 parts of the ecosystem, there are really 4 broad branches to which a person could want to take the CCP. So like I said, it's technically an assessor role. However, it is extremely useful for organizations seeking certification. Like I said, you're going to have to own that process. You're going to have to be able to talk intelligibly and accurately as to your processes, because this assessment isn't a 4-question, it's an interview, and you will have to prove each and every single control is one, documented, and more importantly, practiced. For consultancies, that goes without saying. And again, like Matt was speaking about for external service providers, not only are you more likely than not going to have to comply with CMMC in some way or another, but a lot of organizations are relying on you to maintain their status. So they might be looking to you to open up and provide gap assessments and prepare them with the proper knowledge and right tools that they need to win those contracts. And on that, now we can go to questions.
Yeah, I see. I saw the question of COTS. You answered that. Yeah, COTS means commercial off the shelf. If what you're producing, I can go down to Home Depot or Lowe's or any hardware store and buy it without modification, then it's commercial off the shelf, which is out of scope for this. Because what I am providing the government, I'm providing everyone else. But if I take that COTS product and maybe I paint it blue to a contract specification, or I repackage it in a different way according to a contract modification, then that would cease to become COTS, because I can't buy what you're providing off the shelf. So there's a little caveat in there.
Do you have any advice to organizations that want to implement CMMC on premise, but want to keep the organization network out of scope?
Great question. So this goes to the scoping portion, and we teach about scoping in both the CCP and the CCA class. So in order for something to be out of scope, it would have to be logically or physically separated from everything else. So when we are scoping an organization, we have what we call asset categorizations. The first one, and the most important one, and again, level 2, I'm assuming controlled unclassified information in your environment. The first one is a CUI asset. That is an asset that is intended to store, transmit, or process CUI. Store, transmit, or process. Think of a CUI server. Think of a switch or firewall where the CUI flows through. If it is intended to store, transmit, or process CUI, it is a CUI asset. Then we have security protection assets. Those are assets that are really providing protection to the CUI assets, or I'm using them to meet a particular objective or practice. Things like endpoint protection would be a security protection asset. A SOC SIM solution would be a security protection asset. A vulnerability scanner would be a security protection asset. Things that I'm using to protect those CUI assets. Then we have contractor risk managed assets, and the contractor in this case would be you as the organization providing the goods and services in support of the contract. So we have contractor risk managed assets. Those are assets that are not intended to store, transmit, or process CUI, but could. Things like a laptop connected to a VDI environment in an enclave in a cloud solution. I'm not downloading any CUI to that laptop. I'm not storing any CUI on that laptop, and I'm not really transmitting. All I'm doing is giving screenshots to that laptop, and basically it just becomes a, for those of us who've been around for a while, a dumb terminal where all the storage and processing and everything is done in the enclave. But here's the thing, that laptop could have malware on it where somebody's doing screen grabs or keystroke monitoring. So in that case, it could store, transmit, or process, but it wasn't intended to. And those are handled a little differently. So those three, and then we have specialized assets, things like government property, industrial Internet of Things, test equipment, thing like an oscilloscope, restricted information systems, or operational technology, things like SCADA systems, or like a CNC machine that you can't update. All of that stuff is in scope, but in order for something to be out of scope in a network, it would have to be logically or physically separated. I know that's a long-winded answer, but hopefully that answered the question. So all the assets need to be assessed against 110 controls? No. The CUI assets absolutely do. The SPAs, the security protection assets, are assessed against their applicable practices. How would I assess personnel security against a vulnerability scanner. That'd be really difficult to do. CRMAs, contractor risk managed assets, are handled in what we call a system security plan. And they're handled through basically policies and some technical controls, but they're not assessed against all 110 practices either, just handled in the SSP.
Yeah, if there are no other questions, we'll give it another second or two. Again, I just want to thank Baylor Extended Learning for giving us this platform. And again, just poke out the upcoming in-person dates that we have, both at either Central Texas Cyber Range in Waco and then the Baylor University Dallas, Texas location. These are great opportunities to meet in person people that are going through the same thing that you are, and great way to network as well as get ahead of your of your upcoming assessment. And on that note, thank you all. And if you don't have any other questions, have a great rest of your lunch.
Take care.